took him many years, I think with the help of the Institute of Justice, to get the money back. All right, Ms. Waserman Schultz, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, civil asset forfeiture creates perverse incentives, as we've heard, for law enforcement agencies that stand to benefit financially from increased numbers of seizures. After the assets are seized, we've heard the property may be sold, proceeds kept, and in some states, law enforcement agencies are actually authorized to keep 100% of their forfeiture proceeds, which is a massive windfall for law enforcement. In the vast majority of jurisdictions, forfeited assets don't go into a state's general fund for the well-being of all of its citizens. Instead, the money goes directly to the seizing law enforcement agency to spend however they want. And it has fewer or even no strings attached. Dr. Albin, can you talk about the best evidence that we have that the financial benefits for law enforcement created by our laws are a motive behind civil asset seizures?
Sure, I'd be happy to discuss that. First of all, you can simply look at the time graph of federal civil forfeitures over time after the law was passed in the early 80s, 1984, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, permitting law enforcement to keep the proceeds of civil forfeitures. After that point, civil forfeitures went up dramatically. But probably the most salient example that demonstrates how this profit incentive distorts law enforcement activity was a drug task force that was operating on I-40 outside of Nashville. In the drug interdiction world, money and drugs are viewed as moving in different directions. The drugs are viewed as moving from south to north and from west to east, from basically the borders to the population centers in the East Coast. And the money is viewed as moving in the opposite direction, from east to west and from north to south, back to the borders where the drugs are coming in from cartels and smuggling and that sort of thing. On I-40 outside of Nashville, this drug task force, which was funded almost entirely by civil forfeiture proceeds, was operating 90% of the time on the westbound side of the freeway. That is the side that the money would be moving on. And the local news channel 5 there investigated it using their traffic copters and an undercover investigation and found that 90% of the time they were operating on the money side of the freeway rather than the drug side of the freeway. If you're trying to prevent drug trafficking, you should be operating on the drug side of the freeway because you prevent the drugs from getting to the East Coast, and then there will be no money coming back. But that was the fundamental problem. There would be no money coming back. And if there was no money coming back, this drug task force would not be able to exist because it was funded almost entirely from civil forfeiture proceeds. So that's just one of many examples out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, a Washington Post report which reviewed annual reports that are submitted by local and state agencies to the Justice Department's Equitable Sharing Program shows how law enforcement agencies and drug task forces spend their seizure proceeds. And it found multiple examples of agencies that use seizure proceeds to purchase frivolous items, including large-scale military-style equipment in small communities. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit this report to the record.
Without any objection.
Thank you. And Professor Rulli, what tangible steps can the federal government take right now to remove the profit motive associated with civil asset forfeiture? And then I'd also like to ask Dr. Albin, if both of you could answer, if you could answer the question about the role that law enforcement plays in thwarting civil asset forfeiture reform efforts, even though it's clear that they are necessary.
I'll go first then. This is Lou Rulli. Thank you for that question. We've seen on the local level how powerfully the financial incentive for law enforcement really operates. And in Pennsylvania, for example, 100% of the funds go directly to law enforcement, directly to the people who are making the decisions as to whether or not to seek forfeiture. And we've watched as the prosecutor's offices grow and they spend money on lots of things that are totally unrelated to the safety of our citizens. And so we must direct funds away from these forfeiture funds and directly to the Treasury where there is general accountability, where there's much more transparency, where we have a sense of exactly the data underneath all of these forfeitures. What are the forfeitures for? Who is being impacted by these forfeitures? How is the money being spent? Are people being charged with a crime or not? And certainly our experience on the local level has really confirmed all of the things that have been discussed here today, that reform is so desperately needed.
And Mr. Chairman, would it be okay if the other question was answered quickly?
Yeah, was that addressed to Ms. Ahmed?
Mr. Albin, Professor Albin.
Mr. Albin, yeah.
Yes, I'd be happy to address that. Law enforcement likes to say that they are only enforcing the laws and they don't make the laws. But the dirty little secret of forfeiture reform is the only entity opposed to forfeiture reform is law enforcement. And it's a powerful lobby. I have personal experience with reform efforts in states like Missouri, where there has been widespread bipartisan support for forfeiture reform, eliminating the equitable sharing loophole. And prosecutors and officials from St. Charles County, which profits substantially from civil forfeiture on the interstate there, come in and they lobby key legislators and basically say, you don't want to look soft on crime. You're going to be taking money out of law enforcement's pockets, and we're going to make you pay for that politically. And that sort of process repeats itself all around the country when there are forfeiture reform efforts. They are almost always bipartisan. They are almost always supported nearly unanimously, if not unanimously. And yet law enforcement opposes these reform efforts because they view it as taking money out of their pockets. And that is the primary obstacle that folks who want to reform civil forfeiture law face, that law enforcement is a powerful lobby, that it is able to affect how things happen in the judiciary process and in judicial committees where these bills are typically before. They can get a bill so that it's not heard, it's simply tabled. And you have bills with widespread support that end up moving nowhere because of opposition from law enforcement.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you very much. Mr. Biggs, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm grateful that you're having this hearing. This is an important topic, and Mr. Albin has kind of connected up, and as some of you have, the